Welcome to completing the CSS profile as the non-custodial parent. This presentation will address the why and how of the CSS profile. We will then walk through how to create your College Board account and step through important sections of the CSS profile application. We will then take time to focus on how to report the student's parents and the family members in your household. To start, let's look at the why and how of the CSS profile. When a college is making decisions about financial aid, it first looks at the student's parents. When those parents are no longer together, some colleges will require that each of the student's biological or adoptive parents complete the CSS profile for their own households. This allows the colleges to determine the financial aid eligibility of the student while ensuring the confidentiality of each household. Although both parents complete a CSS profile at the same website, one parent completes a CSS profile that also includes the student's financial information, while the other parent completes a CSS profile that only requests that parent's financial information. The CSS profile application determines which questions to display by asking which parent the student lived with the most during the last year, or which parent provided the greater financial support. If everything is equally shared, then the answer to that question is the parent who will complete the FAFSA with the student. This is often referred to as the custodial parent. For ease of reference in this presentation, the first CSS profile is the one that the student and the custodial parent will complete, while the second CSS profile is the one that the other parent or the non-custodial household will complete. Most families will log into the CSS profile using the student's College Board account to complete the first CSS profile. For the second CSS profile, the parent must create their own account. It's important that each household keep their login information confidential in order to ensure the privacy and confidentiality of each application. A parent completing the second CSS profile must create a College Board account. Instructions for creating an account are found on cssprofile.org or by clicking on Creating a CSS Profile Account for Parent Use on the left. When you, as the parent, creates a College Board account, the most important thing to understand is that even though you are asked for your student's information, you should enter your own here. That is because College Board accounts are considered student accounts, so we ask for the student's information. But when it is you creating your own account, you must create an account with your name, date of birth, and so on. For example, when James Farron is completing a CSS profile for his daughter Eliza, he starts by creating his College Board account, and he does so by entering his information. He enters his name, his date of birth, and even his own high school graduation date. Once done, he will be able to use his login credentials to start his CSS profile application. As long as he does not share his login credentials, the information he provides will be kept private and confidential. Once you're ready to complete your CSS profile, the first thing you must get right is the year. CSS profile will have 2 years available. Remember that you are applying for college financial aid, so you want to apply for the year in which your student will be attending college. For most current high school seniors, that will be 2021-22. Since the applications are academic year specific, if your student is a junior who will not enroll in college in 2021-22, do not submit the CSS profile. You will need to wait until your student's senior year to apply for aid. For the second CSS profile, the cost will be $25, regardless of the number of colleges your student selects. As with the first CSS profile, a fee waiver eligibility calculation is done to determine if you qualify for a fee waiver. The 2019 National School Lunch Program Reduced Price Income Guidelines are used to determine the income cutoff based on the size of the family. For example, for families of 4, the total income would have to be less than $45,000 to qualify for a fee waiver. Now that we have done the overview of the CSS profile, let's take a closer look at completing the application itself. In the CSS profile, it's important to pay attention to whether the questions are about the student or about the parent. If the section is identified as a student section, as it is here in About the Student, only student information is provided. For the second CSS profile, there are fewer student sections, so it's important to note whom the section is about. James's daughter Eliza is applying to a number of colleges. James and Eliza's mother Bria are divorced. Eliza lives with her mother and stepfather. Her mother and stepfather provided their financial information on the CSS profile that Eliza completed. As we know, her father James is completing his own CSS profile application for her. As with many aspects of filing paperwork for college, the CSS profile starts by asking questions about Eliza. James knows that these pieces are important to get right, so Eliza's CSS profile can be properly matched with his own CSS profile. He takes care to report Eliza's full name and her date of birth correctly. Eliza is often short for Elizabeth, and James should have reported Elizabeth if that were the case. However, in this case, Eliza is her given name. Not every high school senior completing the CSS profile will already have a CB-FIN aid ID assigned to their first CSS profile. But if that identifier is available, it is helpful to enter it here. If you received an email notification about completing the CSS profile from the College Board, your student's CB-FIN aid ID will be in that email. If it isn't available, don't worry, just keep going. After completing the demographic information on Eliza, James is given the opportunity to double-check everything. He carefully checks each question. When satisfied that everything is correct, he checks the box at the bottom and selects Save and Continue. One of the biggest mistakes parents make is to answer these student status questions for themselves and not for their student. Most high school seniors will not have legal dependents they support, nor will they be veterans. Remember, you will need to answer these student status questions about your student and not about yourself. Now, it might seem odd to report all of the student's parents, step-parents, and current partners of the student's parents, but it is really important to do so. When a student has parents who are no longer together, and the student's colleges require that both of the student's parents file their own CSS profile, it's important for us to know who the parents are and to which household they belong. To do that, we start by asking for all of the parents. Here, James reports himself and Bria and Sean Windsor, Eliza's mother and stepfather. He selects father to describe his relationship to Eliza, mother to describe Bria's, and stepfather to describe Sean's. This section is crucial to properly identify which application is the first CSS profile and which is the second. Think about this as a two-step process. First, we determine which parents the student lived with the most or which parents provided the greater financial support. Remember, these are the parents who will also provide their information on the first CSS profile and on the FAFSA with the student. Both CSS profile applications should have these parents identified in the Parents Student Lived With question. Second, we ask which parents will be completing the rest of this application. If it's the students that the parent lived with, the application becomes the first CSS profile. If it's the other parent, the application becomes the second CSS profile. James reports that Eliza lives with Bria and Sean. He then reports that he will be providing his information on this application. Finally, he reports that his current marital status is divorced or no longer in a domestic partnership. At this point, this is the second CSS profile application. A common mistake is for both households to identify as the parents the student lives with because they share everything equally. When the application arrives at the college, the financial aid officer will have to do extra work to designate one CSS profile as the first and the other as the second. This can delay the financial aid process unnecessarily and cause other issues in how the student is asked to provide additional information. Let's take a minute to look at how the family completed the first CSS profile. Eliza and her mother, Bria, reported that Eliza lived with Bria and Sean. Their answer to this question is the same as James answered. But in the second part, they reported that Bria and Sean will provide their information on the application and report that they are currently married. Their application is now clearly designated as the first CSS profile. Eliza will also answer questions about her own income and assets. Further, Eliza will select the colleges to receive the information from her CSS profiles. The second CSS profile cannot select colleges. Once both applications arrive at the financial aid office, the aid officer will have two CSS profiles that give a clear picture of both households and allows the aid officer to determine the contribution of Eliza's biological or adoptive parents and Eliza's eligibility for institutional financial aid. If James saw this message, it would have been important for him to understand that critical information was reported differently in his CSS profile than in Eliza's CSS profile, or that Eliza had not yet selected her colleges, or that none of the colleges she selected required James to complete a CSS profile. If James got this message, he would have to contact Eliza to check both the demographic information he provided and to review her list of schools and their CSS profile requirements. Once James starts to report his income and assets, his CSS profile experience is very similar to what Bria and Sean experienced. The questions will be based on the kind of tax return James filed and the assets he owns. The CSS profile tutorial is available to walk you through reporting income. To access that tutorial, click on the CSS profile tutorial link. When James was asked to report his dependent family members, he initially thought he would only count himself. After all, Eliza and her sister Margaret live with Bria. And based on the rules for the first CSS profile, you might assume that Eliza and Margaret would only be counted in Bria and Sean's household. But it isn't quite like that. Even though Eliza and Margaret live with their mother most of the time, James still includes them when he completes the dependent summary. James is their parent, so he is instructed to report both of them in his household. In short, the biological or adoptive children that James and Bria share are reported in both households. This is very different from the way the federal government instructs families to report shared children on their tax return. And that's because the tax returns are trying to determine which tax return gets to claim tax credits for each child. Tax credits are per person, so parents can't share the tax credits for their children. But that is not what the CSS profile is trying to determine. Both parents are expected to provide for their children, so each parent is expected to report shared children in each of their households. The CSS profile has already accounted for James and for Eliza, so he now reports Margaret. If anyone else lived with him and he provided more than half of their support, he would add them to his CSS profile. Since this isn't the case, he now clicks on Save and Continue. The Student Resource section asks James about his support for Eliza or about other sources of support he's aware of. In the student's parents question, he is asked how much support he expects to provide. He should also report support from any relatives he knows of. Finally, James is asked to report the value of any tuition benefits provided by his employer for his dependent children. James didn't have any special circumstances to report when he submitted his CSS profile, but if he had, this would have been his opportunity to tell the financial aid officer his story. This can be one of the most informative sections of the CSS profile for the aid officer, so any information that needs to be shared with the aid officer should be reported here. If the exact condition is not listed, other can be selected. This year, we have also added a COVID-19 box in case your family was affected financially by the COVID-19 pandemic. Be sure to be specific and include annual amounts where applicable, like amounts paid in support of another family member. One of the last steps was for James to review the questions and his responses in his CSS profile. This section can be printed or saved as a PDF. Regardless, this is a good opportunity to stop and check everything one last time to make certain that the information being submitted is correct. The dashboard gives real-time application status for the CSS profile you're filing. Each dashboard is personalized to the applicant. James's dashboard for the CSS profile he completed for Eliza will list the colleges that will receive his information and their important dates. Once he submitted his application, his submission date was displayed as well as a payment receipt and an opportunity to save or print his application responses. Also, Eliza's dashboard will display the date James submitted his CSS profile. Eliza will also know if James needs to submit any documents in support of her CSS profile. It will be Eliza's responsibility to let James know what he needs to provide and how, but Eliza and her mother will not be able to see the information James reported on his CSS profile as long as James does not share his login information. Before we finish, let's review a few of the more common mistakes that parents make when completing the CSS profile. Applying for the wrong academic year is a big one. Because the student is enrolled as a high school senior in 2020-21, the inclination is to select the 2020-21 CSS profile. But the CSS profile is for the year the student will be attending college, so that will be 2021-22. Getting the student demographic information wrong. Getting the student's information right seems easy, but being off a day or a year on a birthday, or using the student's common name rather than their legal name, can make a huge difference in matching the student's two CSS profiles. Remember that the purpose of our questions about where the students live is to make certain the CSS profile applications are properly classified. The student will fill out the first CSS profile with one parent. The second CSS profile will not have any student income or asset information. If the student's school gets two applications with student information, or two applications but no student information, this can seriously delay the process of the student's financial aid application. Many non-custodial parents fail to report the biological or adoptive children they share with a custodial household. These children should be reported in both households since both parents are expected to provide for them. This brings us to the end of our presentation. We hope this information helps you to become a successful applicant. For more information, please visit the links provided.